Hello everybody, welcome back to another episode of Mega Projects. We're back in the USSR today looking at Stalin's White Sea Baltic Canal, which killed 250,000 people. Because, of course it did. In terms of mega projects with a dark and bloody history, it's hard to look past the 227-kilometer, that's 141-mile stretch of water that connects the White Sea, Lake Ladoga, and the Baltic Sea in the northwest of Russia. Known as the White Sea Baltic Canal, this was one of the Soviet Union's first large-scale construction projects, and it opened for business in 1933. As a feat of engineering, it was a highly impressive achievement, but that is certainly not why people remember this canal, or to use its name before 1961, the Stalin White Sea Baltic Canal. This was a project that exclusively used labor taken from the Gulag system, and the human cost was absolutely enormous. Officially, 25,000 people died building this canal, and when the Soviet Union gives you a massive death count like that, you know that they are severely underplaying it. Other sources place the true figure close to 250,000 people, and this was horror on a truly Soviet scale. Today, the canal is still widely used, though far less so since the fall of the USSR. Transporting everything from oil, machinery, people, and even military hardware, the White Sea Baltic Canal was never quite as brilliant as the Soviets made out, thanks in part to it being too shallow as a result of timetable restrictions, and it remains one of the most tragic construction projects of the last 100 years, and that really is saying quite a lot. The idea of building a waterway of some kind in the region was first mentioned almost 300 years ago during the reign of Peter the Great, Russia's emperor who ruled between 1682 and 1725. At this point, canals have been in use around the world for some time, but with varying degrees of purpose. The Grand Canal in China is now nearly 1,500 years old, but the construction of canals really picked up after the start of the Industrial Revolution. Britain, Italy, and France were the major canal builders in the early days, and by the start of the 20th century, there were a huge 6,400 kilometers, that's 4,000 miles worth of canals in just Britain alone. Discussions over a potential canal around the White Sea Baltic area formally began in 1799, and throughout the entirety of the 19th century, designs came and went without a single one being approved. The reason for this being is that it was just really, really expensive, and the state just didn't have that much money, which isn't a huge surprise when you hear that Russia spent around 46% of its annual budget on the military during this period. The idea was rejected so many times that it seems as if there was a momentary swing towards building a railway instead, though nothing came of that idea either. It was probably also super expensive. As Russia's position during World War I began to worsen, it appeared as if the likelihood of a canal connecting the White Sea and the Baltic Sea had just all but evaporated. But what better way to kickstart a sluggish engineering sector than a good old-fashioned revolution? When Russia descended into civil war in February 1917, it was anybody's guess what might emerge. The abdication of the Tsar and his subsequent murder, along with his family, set Russia on course for a radically different path. Almost immediately after the revolution, the canal concept began springing up again, and it appeared as if the stars were finally aligning. A research group from the University of Perm and the Supreme Economic Council began preliminary studies in the area in 1918, but these were called off as the country sank further into bloody civil war. It's really expensive stuff. The battle between the Socialist Red Army, led by Vladimir Lenin, and the White Army, a loose group formed of those supporting political monarchism, was a bitter one that would cost the lives of 1.5 million combatants, but perhaps as many as 8 million Russian citizens in total died due to disease, famine, and armed attacks. By 1922, the Bolsheviks had finally established themselves as the Communist Party, and they now reigned supreme. You probably knew that. This was a period that saw intense geopolitical ramifications, with Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland all establishing themselves as independent states. The rest was consolidated into an organization that would cast a long shadow for the next 70 years, the Soviet Union. By the early 1930s, after the death of Lenin, the Communist Party and the Soviet Union found themselves in the vice-like grip of a quietly spoken Georgian by the name of, you know him, Joseph Stalin. The new leader faced a dizzying array of challenges, not least the need to modernize the Soviet Union. At this time, vast swaths of the USSR were just desperately poor, and many were relying entirely on subsistence farming. When Stalin looked around Europe, he saw countries thundering forward and no doubt wanted exactly the same thing for his homeland. The result was the first of 13 5-year plans. Now, we've actually already done a video here on Mega Projects focusing solely on the first 5-year plan, and we don't really have too much time to dive into the whole thing here, but do go check it out. In fact, that video I really enjoyed, and it didn't get that many views, so we didn't really do the other 5-year plans that followed, even though I wanted to, but, you know, YouTube, if it doesn't get lots of views, it doesn't really make sense for me to make more of them. But go check it out. I think it's really good. Just the really short version of it is that the first Soviet 5-year plan was an astronomically ambitious modernization program that the Soviets undertook between 1928 and 1932, mainly focusing on developing heavy industry, which they actually had quite a bit of success with, and collectivizing agriculture, less successful because it directly or indirectly led to the deaths of around 12 million people from famine and disease. So, if you're interested in finding out about this dark period of Soviet mega modernization, then why not take a look at that video? But for now, let's just continue looking at one of the projects that fell under that 5-year plan, the White Sea-Baltic Canal. In 1930, the Council of Labour and Defence released a report in which it outlined plans and feasibility studies relating to finally building this long-sought-after canal. The project was discussed in length in several Politburo meetings, but it divided opinion. Stalin and several other members were broadly for it, while others had serious reservations, not least over the hazy economic benefits that were being pushed. Now, the two major benefits being touted were the possible increase of timber exports and improved transportation with Siberia. In the region at the time, most industries were fairly limited, and while the Kola Peninsula's mining industrial complex was under construction, it was difficult to justify such massive cost. In response, cost estimates were slashed by a third, with the project slated not to exceed 60 million rubles. That would have been around $13 million at the time, or around $479 million today, which is actually quite reasonable, but I mean also forced labor. The most detailed set of studies so far were then carried out, which explored various options, but all came back with similar conclusions. Original cost estimates had been absurdly low. The new budget for the planned canal was now 359 million rubles, $181 million back then, or around $2.8 billion today, which was certainly a sizable increase, but this was just one of the many obstacles facing the project. There was a lack of dredgers and excavators, along with engineers and technicians experienced in similar constructions. And remember that the decision had already been made to only use Gulag prisoners, which led to the, frankly, rather surreal, but not when you think about the USSR, suggestion to start arresting engineers on trumped-up charges who would then take part in building the canal. It's possibly the most Soviet thing ever. A final meeting was convened, and the project was finally given the go-ahead, but with significant corners cut. The budget was capped, once again at 60 million rubles, or $479 million today, a reduction made possible by the decision to limit the depth of the canal to 3.5 meters, down from 5.4 meters, a small difference that would save a fortune, but would seriously hamper the canal's ability to handle larger boats for its entire lifetime. It would also need to be completed at a breakneck pace, with the schedule of just 2 years earmarked. The construction of the canal was broken into 4, with the route passing through 3 separate major lakes: Lake Vaga-Zero, Lake Aniga, and Lake Ladoga, along with several smaller lakes. Information on the construction process itself is unfortunately severely lacking, but we can piece together enough to give you an image of the horror show that was working on the White Sea-Baltic Canal. Of the 227 kilometers, that's 141 miles, only 48 kilometers needed to be excavated, as the rest passed through rivers or lakes. As I said, it consisted of 4 different sections that were worked on more or less simultaneously. The construction of this canal was astonishing in many ways, not least because the prisoners building it usually needed to design it and work around problems as they went. Forget JCBs, pneumatic drills, and unions. I mean, we definitely know there weren't unions, this was forced labor. This was construction work in the most brutal Soviet sense you can imagine. Prisoners dug into the earth with little more than primitive tools that they had been supplied with, while teams of laborers worked in relays to move stones out of the canal. Basic wooden derrick furnaces were built to melt iron and steel and proved hugely successful, with over 1,000 tons of iron produced that could be used to manufacture machinery. At its peak, it's thought that roughly 100,000 prisoners woke each morning and stumbled weekly out to begin work on the most ambitious construction project in the Soviet Union to date. Overall, the mortality rate was 8.7%, although this climbed to a high of 14% at one point. In a truly sadistic move, Soviet authorities played construction groups against one another with the reward of greater rations and even the distant possibility of early release for the work teams that worked the fastest. Gulag prisons were normally kept secret, but not here. The Soviets not only wanted to showcase their grand project, but also highlight the reforging of prisoners. This supposed rehabilitation was meant to show prisoners who had wronged the Soviet Union how they were now reformed and working hard for the good of the motherland. It was, of course, absolute crap, but many just blindly went along with it. Articles written in the USSR in Construction, which by the way might be the greatest name for a magazine ever, positively dripped with the glories associated with building the canal. And to give you an idea, here's just one passage. People taken from the very dregs. As they came, they thought, this is the end of life for us. But real life had only begun for them. For not only was the nature of the landscape changed, but the nature of the people also. People with a shady past were transformed into honest workers. The only thing missing there would be glorious honest workers. It was brilliant for them, with a death rate of 8.7%. God damn. After the canal's completion, Soviet authorities claimed that 12,484 prisoners were freed as a reward for hard work, and 59,516 prison terms were shortened as a result. We'll leave the integrity of those stats up to you. As 1933 began, the canal was nearing completion, but still had several gaps. With spring promising to bring its usual torrent of rain, it became a race against time to finish construction work. The canal was completed in May 1933, 4 months ahead of schedule. It stretched for 227 kilometers, that's 141 miles, from the Soroka Bay of the White Sea at Belomorsk to the Baltic Sea near St. Petersburg, and included 19 locks along the way. The final cost reached 101 million rubles, roughly $815 million today, a little more than planned, but still less than a quarter of what had been estimated at one point. Isn't it just amazing what you can do with slave laborers, with the carrot of freedom dangling just out of reach? Canal traffic began moving almost immediately on the 28th of May 1933, with the steamship Chekist being the first to traverse the waterway. The canal summit pond, the highest point of the canal, has an elevation of 103 meters, 337 feet, and is 22 kilometers, 14 miles long. It's located between locks 7 and 8. From there, it's a consistent drop down into the Baltic Sea, with the canal passing through 5 lakes of varying sizes. Lake Matka Zero between locks 8 and 9, Lake Viga Zero between locks 9 and 10, Lake Palagorka between locks 10 and 11, Lake Voitskoye between locks 11 and 12, and Lake Matkozhinya between locks 13 and 14. The White Sea-Baltic Canal will forever have a terrible black mark next to it. Recent Russian efforts have sought to reframe the horrific atrocities that took place across the Soviet Union around this time, but, well, not everybody is buying it. Mass graves have been discovered all along the canal route, many revealing bodies with a single bullet hole to the back of the head. Modern Russia might want to paint Joseph Stalin as some kind of misunderstood hero from the past, but many simply refuse to forgive and forget what happened in the Soviet Union during the 1930s. The horrific irony of it all was that the Gulag system had proven itself hugely successful in that it had managed to complete the canal ahead of schedule and more or less on budget. This meant that more and more construction projects were placed under the control of that system, which in turn meant many more thousands died. In fact, Soviet authorities were so impressed that many survivors of the White Sea-Baltic Canal were transferred to begin improvement work on another canal, the Volga-Baltic. So, what a glorious reward for all the work that had been done. As for the canal itself, the decision taken early on to reduce its depth proved debilitating for the White Sea-Baltic Canal, as it could not accommodate large vessels. But it still seen plenty of traffic over the years. Over its first 75 years, 193 million tons of cargo moved along the canal, with its peak annual tonnage coming in 1985, when 7.3 million tons of goods passed through it. However, the fall of the Soviet Union proved disastrous for the canal, and in 2002, just 0.2 million tons went through the canal. A brief experiment to transfer oil along it ended in 2003 after a collision led to 45 tons of oil leaking out into the canal. Today, the canal is still regularly in use, but it's probably fair to say that it's never been the glorious wonder project that Comrade Stalin had envisioned. Instead, it is perhaps the cruelest reminder of what the Soviet Union was willing to do to its own citizens in the name of progress. A while ago, we did a video on Russia's Road of Bones, an eastern highway that cost the lives of between 250,000 and 1 million people through forced labor. And sadly, we can now add the White Sea-Baltic Canal to the list of horrific Soviet construction projects that may have blazed new trails, but came at a devastatingly high cost. So I'm not going to ask whether you enjoyed that video, but I do hope you found it interesting, certainly illuminating. Please do hit that like button below, subscribe, and thank you for watching.